Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento. Hook. Imagine a man who believed his blood was disappearing, that his organs were deteriorating from within, and that the only way to survive was to kill. He did not hide. He did not attempt to be unnoticed. He left doors open and acted without any plan. He became known as the Vampire of Sacramento, but the reality of his story was far darker than any nickname. Today, we recount the life of Richard Chase, a man whose severe mental illness, combined with systemic negligence, led to a chain of tragedies that shocked a city and challenged the limits of understanding human behavior. Childhood. Richard Trenton Chase was born in 1950 in California. His childhood was turbulent. His father was authoritarian, often abusive, and struggled with alcoholism. His mother was emotionally distant and displayed coldness toward him and his siblings. Richard grew up withdrawn, anxious, and socially isolated. He had almost no friends, rarely interacted with peers, and struggled to form basic social bonds. From a young age, he displayed signs of obsessive-compulsive behavior. He had repeated fears of contamination and was preoccupied with death and illness. These early anxieties, combined with the lack of parental support and an unstable household, laid the foundation for deeper psychological issues. Teachers noted that he was intelligent in some areas, but inconsistent and unfocused. He appeared fearful, anxious, and easily overwhelmed by social situations. Adolescence. During his teenage years, his mental health worsened. He experienced frequent panic attacks, intrusive fears, and unusual physical complaints. He was convinced that his body was failing, that his organs were deteriorating, and that his blood was disappearing. He described these feelings to anyone who would listen, but adults dismissed them as exaggerations or attention-seeking behavior. By 17 or 18, he had stopped attending school regularly. He could not concentrate on learning and expressed little interest in the future. Social isolation and constant anxiety intensified his psychological decline. Friends and neighbors noted odd behavior. He would sometimes remain in his room for days, speak to himself, or pace continuously. Early adulthood and psychiatric diagnosis. In his early 20s, Richard's symptoms escalated to full-blown psychosis. He exhibited paranoid thoughts, auditory hallucinations, and obsessive fears about his body. In 1972, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His delusions centered primarily on his blood and internal organs. He believed that doctors were lying to him, that medications were poisoning him, and that the world was actively trying to harm him. He was admitted to psychiatric hospitals multiple times, receiving temporary treatment. However, after each release, he refused to continue taking medication. His condition deteriorated rapidly without supervision. Each relapse strengthened his delusions and reinforced his obsessive beliefs. Richard's fixation on his blood intensified. He became convinced that if he did not replenish it, he would die. For him, this was not metaphorical, it was literal. The belief consumed him and drove his actions. Early signs of danger. Initially, Richard experimented on animals. He would catch them, kill them, and extract their blood. Neighbors became concerned about his behavior, but authorities failed to recognize the potential danger. Police reports were sparse, and psychiatric institutions lacked the legal authority to hold him for extended treatment. By the mid-1970s, Richard was almost completely isolated. He lived alone, did not work, and rarely left his apartment. His living conditions became unsanitary, with waste accumulating and food spoiling. His behavior became chaotic and erratic. He believed he was being watched, that people intended to harm him, and that his organs were dying. First murders. When Richard committed his first murders, he did not perceive them as crimes. In his mind, these acts were necessary for survival. He acted without planning or strategy, did not hide his actions and left doors open. His victims were random, chosen based on convenience rather than any pattern. Richard did not present himself as a typical serial killer. He was not calculating, charming, or methodical. His murders were driven entirely by delusional necessity. Each act reinforced his internal logic that killing was required to preserve his life. The city of Sacramento was thrown into fear during 1977 and 1978. The murders occurred without pattern, creating widespread panic. Residents feared leaving doors open or allowing strangers inside. Police struggled to create a profile as Richard's behavior did not match conventional serial killer patterns. Arrest. Richard Chase was apprehended through a combination of forensic evidence and witness testimony. At the time of arrest, he appeared confused and disoriented. He offered no resistance. During questioning, he spoke incoherently, explaining his actions through his delusional framework. He did not deny the crimes and did not view them as malicious. Trial. The trial was a national spectacle. Psychiatric experts detailed Richard's extensive history of mental illness, including early signs in childhood, adolescent deterioration, and chronic delusions. Despite this, the court found him legally sane and sentenced him to death. The verdict was highly controversial. Some viewed him as a dangerous murderer. Others saw a profoundly ill man whom the system had failed to contain. Prison life. In prison, Richard's mental health continued to decline. He became obsessed with conspiracies, believed he was being poisoned, and feared attacks from other inmates. He refused food, rejected medication, and rarely interacted with others. His isolation intensified his delusions and paranoia. He exhibited self-harming behavior, including attempts to harm himself physically. Daily behavior and mental state. Prison reports described Richard as erratic, fearful, and incoherent at times. He would pace his cell for hours, speak to imaginary voices, and insist on unusual routines. Guards noted that he often refused to eat or drink, citing imaginary contamination. Psychiatric evaluations indicated that his schizophrenia remained untreated and his risk of self-harm was extremely high. Media and public reaction. News coverage of Richard Chase was extensive and sensationalized. Newspapers dubbed him the Vampire of Sacramento, emphasizing the gruesome and unusual aspects of his crimes. The public was horrified, not only by the murders, but by the apparent randomness and lack of motive. Experts debated whether his actions were the result of pure malice, mental illness, or a combination of both. Systemic failures. Richard Chase's case highlighted failures in the mental health and criminal justice systems. Multiple opportunities existed to prevent his crimes. Early psychiatric interventions, closer monitoring after hospitalization, and community awareness could have altered the trajectory. Instead, systemic gaps allowed a severely ill man to act unchecked, leading to multiple deaths. Final acts. In 1980, Richard Chase took his own life in his prison cell. His death ended the immediate cycle of violence, but did not undo the damage he had caused. Families of victims were left grieving, and the public was left to confront the consequences of untreated severe mental illness. Richard's life, crimes, and death serve as a case study in the dangers of untreated schizophrenia, the limits of institutional oversight, and the human cost of neglect. Legacy. The story of Richard Chase is not just a tale of murder. It is a cautionary account of mental illness, isolation, and societal oversight. He was a profoundly ill individual whose delusions dictated his actions. He was a man who could have been helped, isolated, and treated, but was instead allowed to spiral into chaos. His crimes were not born solely of evil, but of untreated psychosis, compounded by systemic inaction.